Hello, in this video we'll be talking about implant final impression techniques. There are three main ways of making an impression for an implant: open tray, closed tray, and a scan. Let's start with the closed tray method. The impression post is seated onto the implant. Sometimes a screw is used to secure it in position. The impression tray along with the impression material are seated on top of the impression post. Once the impression material sets, the pieces are separated and the impression post is seated back onto the impression along with the implant analog. Now let's take a look at a type-it-on example. We'll be using the no-bell system here, but they're all pretty similar. The implant impression post is inserted, making sure full seating is achieved. A screwdriver is then used to tighten the impression post onto the implant. And the impression tray is then seated on top of the impression post. Once the material is set, you can reseat the impression post into its space. It can only go in one way, so make sure you've lined up the geometric shape of the impression post to its impression. To seat the impression post as easily as I did, it's often recommended to screw the impression post to the analog before reseating it back into the impression. Now let's move on to the open tray impression technique. The impression post is seated onto the implant and tightened in place using the provided screw. The impression tray used to make the impression should have a hole that corresponds to that screw in order for it to show through the impression when it's fully seated. When the impression sets, the screw is loosened and removed from the post. The impression tray is then removed with the implant impression post inside. The analog can be reattached to the impression post using that same screw. Now let's take a look at a type-it-on example. Before starting the impression, pick an appropriate tray and mark where the implant is. Drill a hole over the implant and verify that you can see the implant through the tray. The impression post is seated onto the impression, and the screw is tightened either by hand or using a screwdriver. Verify that you can fully seat the tray without it binding to the impression post, and seat the impression. It's very important to wipe away any impression material above the screw to verify that the screw has come through the hole and to have access to it in order to loosen it and remove the impression. Once the impression is set, the screw is loosened with a screwdriver initially and then pulled out entirely out of the impression. The impression can now be removed and inspected. Now let's move on to the last impression technique, the scan. Different types of implants and scanners might require different techniques, but generally a scan of the implant is made without anything on top, and then an implant scan body is placed, and another scan is made. Let's take a look at a type-it-on example using the 3-shape scanner to make the impression. An initial scan is made of the implant with nothing attached. It's important to make sure you've captured both interproximal contact areas adjacent to the implant. It's always recommended to make a full arch scan, but for the purposes of this demonstration, we'll make a quadrant impression. The scan body is then placed on top of the implant. For this particular system, a special screwdriver is used to tighten the scan body onto the implant. Another scan is made, this time to capture the position of the scan body on top of the implant. And the impression is complete. Thanks for watching, and we hope that video was helpful.